Perhaps the most plausible variation of the official story is that Glenn's plane was accidentally hit by the payload of an aborted British bombing raid, which had to be dumped into the Channel. Fred Shaw, interviewed more than 40 years after the tragic event, was the navigator of one of the Lancaster bombers.
You must remember this was our first actual operation, and I had never seen a bomb burst before. What I did when we were jettisoning our cookies, I put my head in my observation blister on the starboard side and looked down, and I saw the cookies exploding just above the surface, which they were designed to do. And I could see the blast waves, greyish, shimmering waves of presumably highly compressed air. And then, flying south, the opposite direction to which we were going, I saw a high-wing monoplane. I recognized it as a Nudon Norseman. It's the very small tail plane and parallel chord high wing. It was way below us. We were at 4,000 feet. But this chappie was down, I judged it to be about 1,500. And then just before he disappeared under the leading edge of the wing, I saw him flip over, literally. He went over to port, and there was a splash and nothing else to be seen.
During 1945, the AEF band continued its work on the continent under the direction of Sergeant Jerry Gray, and this was one of his new pieces called Passage Interdit. More interesting than all the speculative theorising about Miller's sad disappearance is the question of what it did for his posthumous reputation. Helen Mayhew, Lauren Schoenberg and David Berger again.
It always helps when an artist dies at the peak of his popularity, because he can then never be seen to be in decline or resting on his laurels or making music that wasn't as good as when he was at his absolute peak. And I think a lot of people would say that Miller did die when he was at his peak of popularity. But regardless of his untimely death, I think that his music would have survived anyway.
Nobody wants to die. He had a lovely wife and had a wonderful future to look forward to. But even Glenn Miller, if he was judging now, would realize that dying the way that he did more for his music than probably what would have happened even if he had come back after the Second World War. His tragic death gave him an iconic status.
This was a tremendous problem for the Army, the American Army. They, Miller was such an icon. They needed to make him into a hero. And so they made up this myth, which made it very romantic and everything.
For a while after the end of the war, saxophonist and singer Tex Beneke led a Glenn Miller band with the backing of the Miller estate. But the real romanticisation of his legacy started in 1954 with Hollywood's version of The Glenn Miller Story.
Historically, it was all over the shop. The business of the clarinet lead did not come about as the film represented it. This guy busting his lip and not being able to play. All sorts of aspects of it were incorrect in historic terms.
I've always been amused by people who feign surprise that the Goodman story or the Miller story were works of fiction. I mean, that's even funnier to me. Who would ever think that a Hollywood biopic would tell the truth? That's not what it's about.
It got across well just the sheer panache and excitement of the band and those tunes. Something of the story of the struggle, because it was a struggle, there's no question. In his early days, with his first bands, Miller struggled. There were all sorts of, diversions along the way when things didn't quite happen as he hoped they would. Then, of course, ultimately success came. So I think it made its impact Number one, Louis Armstrong was it, with the best of his band, you know, at the time when you had people like Cozy Cole and Barney Bigard, this so-called jam session sequence in the film.
For that soundtrack recording, James Stewart, in the role of Glenn Miller, had the benefit of ex-Miller trombonist Paul Tanner coaching him on the technical aspects of miming his part. And he had studio trombonist Joe Uckel, a former Red Nichols and Dorsey Brothers sideman, playing the actual solo on Basin Street Blues. An astute choice of repertoire since, as we noted in our first programme, Glenn helped to write the tune as we now know it.
James Stewart doesn't convince me as a trombonist, but you get to see some real musicians, and there's an idea of the wartime and big swing bands and Americans. Those storylines are real, and the music is always there in the background, and I think that it couldn't have done any harm at all. I'm sure it brought a lot of people to the music of Glenn Miller.
The main evidence of Miller's continued popularity is the existence of the various Miller bands in the UK. One is run by Miller's nephew John, who took over the band of his late father, Glenn's brother Herb Miller. And also, of course, there's one that's been run in the UK for years by Ray McVeigh. And as far as I can tell, they're all doing good business and in demand from audiences all over the place.
Sometimes it seems that Glenn Miller has conquered the world even more successfully than General Motors, that other great GM. And for that matter, there are several more GM crops in the shape of Miller repertory bands on the European continent.
The jazz world is so snobby about it because they don't like things that are too accessible. And also anything that's very popular, I think they are a bit suspicious of, because they like to keep the music for themselves and for it to be intellectually superior to your regular man in the street. Miller's music, you could almost compare it to the popularity in art of Jack Vetriano's paintings, in that the art establishment thinks they're rubbish, romantic, sentimental and too accessible, whereas people absolutely love them.
Time and time again, some young person will come up and ask for a Glenn Miller tune, and I have to say, well, they had 17 musicians and music, and I can't recreate all those things, but it's astonishing that they've heard of it, and they like it enough to get up from a table and come and approach the band.
People love to dance to it. I mean, even youngsters, if you've ever seen the London Swing Dance Society in action, they still love dancing to it, and the music still speaks to people. People object to the fact that when you hear Glenn Miller's music played, they do go to the original charts, so you're liable to hear exactly the same notes played. And that, of course, is anathema to jazz people, because the essence of jazz is to have some element of improvisation. So I think to actually lump Miller's music in with jazz is just, you're just barking up the wrong tree.
If you're seeking signs of Glenn Miller's influence on later jazz, you could do worse than look at the 1940s band of pianist Claude Thornhill, an early colleague of Miller's in the Ray Noble Orchestra. Some of Thornhill's scores, and those of his staff writer Gil Evans, sit very easily alongside the ballads of the Miller Band.
Moon dreams dancing on my pillow. Moon dreams recall a night of paradise with you out of a blue.
The song Moon Dreams, written by Miller's longtime pianist Chummy McGregor, Firstly, as performed by the AAF band with singer Johnny Desmond, and then in a very similar arrangement by Gil Evans for Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool Band in the late 40s. Incidentally, the French horn player in that group, Junior Collins, was a former member of Miller's AEF band. And we shouldn't ignore the arrangements of Thad Jones, whose band with Mel Lewis began in the 1960s using the soprano saxophone as a lead instrument in much the same way that Glenn had used the clarinet. Finally, as Helen Mayhew points out, Miller's contribution has even been re-examined by some quite current performers.
The songs have been used as jazz standards, even by contemporary jazzmen. I mean, the bass player Charlie Haydn, who's a well-respected contemporary musician, he did an absolutely beautiful bass solo on his version of Moonlight Serenade. I think it was from his album Haunted Heart. Anyway, a new melody to that, and it was picked up recently by the singer Kurt Elling, who added a new lyric, and he called it Flirting with Twilight, and it became the title track to, I think, what is Kurt Elling's finest album. And it works fantastically well. You cannot argue with a beautiful melody like that.
Moonlight Serenade by Charlie Haydn with saxophonist Ernie Watts. So it seems that Glenn Miller's achievement may not be quite the enclosed and self-referential phenomenon that it's thought to be by some people, even by its advocates. But then that's what we found in different ways throughout these 4 programmes. Certainly, for all its associations with World War II, and for all the mystique surrounding the disappearance of Glenn Miller himself, the music is still the music.
I've played in a lot of big bands, and I've noticed over many years that there's an antipathy towards Glenn Miller, that there's a resistance to his music, that there's some kind of condescension or dismissal about the man and his band. And I've always wondered why. And I also wonder, why have these attitudes been focused on Glenn Miller, not on Tommy Dorsey, or not on someone else who is kind of similar?
If you compare Miller's band with the other white swing bands, there was no amazing instrumental virtuoso out front in Miller's band. Whereas in Benny Goodman's, Artie Shaw, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, Jack Teagarden, Jack Jenny, Bunny Berrigan, Gene Krupa, Harry James as well. I mean, they're all wonderful virtuosi of their specific instrument. People went to see them, and the band was with them. The Miller band, people didn't go to see Glenn with his rimless glasses glinting away, sort of conducting gently. They went to hear that sound.
It became the standard for big bands. His instrumentation of 8 brass and 5 saxophones became the standard for many, many years. Miller set the standard, and the swing era didn't really evolve much past that, because when musicians did go past that, the audience didn't go with them. That's about as far as the popular audience would go.
I'm Guy Barker. The series In the Mood, written by Brian Priestley, was a heavy entertainment production for BBC Radio 3.